I'm Maya, 28, and everything changed when Jessica Chen held up my mother's homemade dumplings in the cafeteria and announced to everyone that my lunch smelled like a farm. The way she pinched her nose with one hand while dangling my carefully wrapped lunch container with the other, her voice carrying across the entire seventh grade cafeteria like she was making some grand proclamation. The smell of ginger and pork and my grandmother's secret seasoning blend that had filled our kitchen with warmth every Sunday morning suddenly became this toxic cloud that made everyone within a three-table radius turn to stare at me. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how a single moment of shame led to everything I never saw coming. Growing up as the daughter of recent immigrants meant living between two worlds that never quite aligned. My parents, Lian and Wei Chen, had arrived from Guangzhou 3 years before I was born, carrying nothing but their determination, and my grandmother's handwritten recipe book wrapped in silk cloth. My mother approached American assimilation like a research project, studying other parents at school pickup, memorizing the contents of other kids' lunchboxes, trying to decode the unspoken rules of belonging that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. She packed my lunches with the same careful attention. She gave everything else. Each dumpling folded to perfection, the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother's mother had taught her. That Tuesday in October started like any other day. Mom had woken up at 5:30 to prepare fresh dumplings, the kitchen filled with the rhythmic sound of her rolling pin against the counter and the gentle bubbling of the steamer. She wrapped them in the insulated container Dad had bought specifically for keeping Chinese food warm, adding a small thermos of hot tea and a handful of lychees from the Asian market 40 minutes away. As she handed me my lunch that morning, she smiled with the quiet pride of someone who believed that food was love made visible, that sharing our culture through carefully prepared meals would somehow build bridges I didn't even know I needed. The cafeteria was its usual chaos of middle school social dynamics, groups clustered around their designated tables like small tribes defending territory. I sat with the other kids who didn't quite fit anywhere else, the ones who were too quiet or too different, or too new to claim space in the established hierarchies. When I opened my lunch container, the steam rose like a small prayer, carrying with it the familiar comfort of home. The dumplings were still warm, their surfaces glistening slightly, perfectly pleated in the way that it had taken my mother years to master. For just a moment, I felt proud. These weren't the sad sandwiches or processed snacks that filled most lunch trays. These were made with care, with tradition, with love. That's when Jessica Chen's voice cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade. She was 2 tables away, surrounded by her usual cluster of followers, but her words were loud enough for half the room to hear. "Oh my God, what is that smell?" she said, her voice dripping with theatrical disgust. "It smells like someone brought their farm to lunch." The laughter started immediately, rippling outward from her table like a stone thrown into still water. Other kids started looking around, trying to identify the source of the offensive odor, and Jessica's finger pointed directly at me, at my open lunch container, at the dumplings my mother had woken up early to make. The heat of embarrassment flooded my face as the conversation stopped and heads turned in my direction. Mrs. Patterson, the lunch monitor, glanced over with the uncomfortable expression adults wear when they witness cruelty but don't know how to address it without making things worse. I closed the container quickly, but the damage was done. The smell lingered, and so did the stares. "Maybe next time bring something that doesn't make the whole cafeteria smell like a barn," Jessica added, her friends giggling behind their hands. I sat there with my untouched lunch, trying to smile like it didn't matter, like the careful work my mother had put into each dumpling wasn't being dismissed as something disgusting and foreign. The rest of the lunch period passed in a blur of whispered comments and sideways glances. I pushed the container to the bottom of my backpack and spent the remaining 20 minutes picking out a package of crackers someone had left on the table. When the bell rang, I threw away my mother's dumplings in the cafeteria trash can, watching them disappear under layers of discarded food and crumpled napkins. The waste felt like a betrayal, but the thought of enduring another moment of that public humiliation felt worse. That afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table, pretending to focus on homework, Mom bustled around preparing dinner with the same enthusiasm she brought to every meal. The kitchen smelled like garlic and star anise, like the childhood I was already learning to be ashamed of. "How was lunch today, Beta?" she asked, using the Cantonese endearment that always made me feel small and protected. "Did your friends like the dumplings?" Her face was bright with expectation, waiting for me to share some story about cultural exchange and new friendships built over shared food. I looked up at her hopeful expression and felt something crack inside my chest. "It was great, Mom," I lied, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat. Everyone loved them. The next morning, I stood in front of the open lunch container Mom had prepared, identical dumplings steaming in their neat rows, and felt my stomach turn with something that had nothing to do with hunger. The memory of Jessica's voice echoing across the cafeteria, the way everyone had turned to stare, the laughter that had followed me through the rest of the day, all of it crashed over me like a wave I couldn't escape. I grabbed the container and my backpack, kissing Mom goodbye with the same routine cheerfulness I'd perfected. But this time, I had a plan. The dumpster behind the school gym became my secret shame. I arrived 15 minutes early and threw away my mother's carefully prepared lunch container and all, burying it under the maintenance crew's discarded materials so no one would find it. The waste made me feel sick, but not as sick as the thought of sitting in that cafeteria again, enduring more comments about farm smells and foreign food. I spent lunch period in the library, telling Mrs. Rodriguez I had a research project, my stomach growling quietly while I pretended to read about American history. When anyone asked about my missing lunch, I smiled and said I'd eaten early, that I wasn't hungry, that I was trying to lose weight before spring pictures. By the third day, Mom noticed the container wasn't coming home dirty. "Did you forget to bring home your lunchbox again?" she asked, checking my backpack with the methodical attention she gave everything. "Oh, I ate at school today," I said, the lie coming easier now. "They had pizza, and all my friends were sharing their food." Her face lit up with a kind of happiness that made my chest ache. "That's wonderful, Beta. You're making friends with the American children. This is how you become part of the community." She started humming while she cleaned the kitchen, pleased that her daughter was finally fitting in, unaware that fitting in meant rejecting everything she'd tried to give me. The hunger was constant now, a hollow ache that followed me through morning classes and made it hard to concentrate during afternoon lessons. I learned to time my bathroom breaks with the cafeteria lunch periods, slipping past the crowds of kids eating together, avoiding the sight of normal families' normal food. Sometimes I'd buy a small bag of chips from the vending machine with the dollar bills I found in my jacket pockets. But mostly, I just waited until I got home, telling myself the gnawing emptiness was worth it if it meant avoiding another moment like that Tuesday with Jessica Chen. After 2 weeks of thrown-away lunches and increasingly creative excuses, Mom made an announcement that felt like a small victory. "I've been thinking," she said during dinner, her voice careful in the way it got when she was navigating unfamiliar territory. "Maybe you would like American lunches better, more like what your classmates eat." She'd been researching again? I could tell, probably asking other mothers at the grocery store, maybe watching American families in the checkout line. "Tomorrow I'll pack you sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly, like on the television shows." The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. No more dumplings meant no more comments about farm smells, no more carefully folded wontons that marked me as different, as foreign, as someone who didn't belong. "That sounds great, Mom," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I meant it. She smiled, with the tentative hope of someone who'd been trying to solve a puzzle she didn't fully understand. "I want you to be happy at school," she said. "I want you to have friends." The American lunches were a revelation in their ordinariness. Peanut butter and jelly on white bread, individual bags of chips, apple slices in plastic containers, juice boxes with cartoon characters on the sides. I could eat in the cafeteria again without fear, blending into the sea of similar brown bags and plastic lunchboxes. When other kids glanced at my food, there was nothing to comment on, nothing to mock. The relief was so profound, I almost cried the first time I bit into that generic sandwich, tasting acceptance in its processed sweetness. But the changes at home were harder to ignore. Mom stopped waking up early to prepare fresh dumplings, complex aromas that had once defined our mornings. She approached sandwich making with the same careful attention she'd given traditional cooking, but there was something deflated about her movements, something resigned. Dad noticed too. I'd catch him watching Mom during dinner, his expression puzzled as she served us increasingly American meals, as if she was slowly erasing parts of herself to make space for our assimilation. The breaking point came when my grandmother visited from San Francisco, where she lived with my uncle's family. Popo arrived with her usual collection of carefully wrapped ingredients, ready to spend the week teaching me traditional recipes the way she'd taught my mother decades before. "Where is my little dumpling maker?" she asked in Cantonese, her arms full of packages that smelled like star anise and dried mushrooms. But when she tried to pull me into the kitchen for our usual cooking lessons, I complained of a stomachache, retreating to my room while she and Mom spoke in hushed, worried voices. That night, I heard them through the thin walls of our apartment, Popo's voice rising with confusion and hurt as Mom explained my new preferences, my American friends, my need to fit in. "She doesn't want to learn anymore," Mom said, her voice flat with defeat. "She says the traditional food is too strong, too different. She wants to be like the other children." Popo's response was a long silence, followed by words I pretended not to understand, about roots and identity, and children who forget where they come from. The next morning, I found Popo packing her ingredients back into their careful wrappings, her movements sharp with disappointment. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered in Cantonese, "Don't forget who you are, little one. Don't let them make you forget." But I was already forgetting, already choosing the safety of invisibility over the pride of heritage. As her taxi pulled away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and loss, like I'd won something important but couldn't remember what I'd given up to get it. The final confirmation of my successful transformation came 3 weeks later when Jessica Chen complimented my new lunch. "Finally eating normal food, I see," she said, not unkindly, just matter-of-factly, like she was acknowledging my successful completion of some unspoken test. I smiled and nodded, biting into my peanut butter sandwich while she moved on to her next conversation. Later that day, I found Mom's recipe book hidden under my bed, moved there during one of her cleaning sessions when the traditional cooking had stopped. I shoved it deeper under the mattress, out of sight, where I wouldn't have to think about what it represented or what I was choosing to leave behind. The silence that settled over our dinner table was different from the comfortable quiet that used to fill our kitchen, while Mom cooked and Popo told stories about the old country. This new silence was heavy with things we couldn't say, weighted down by the growing distance between who we used to be and who we were becoming. Mom served frozen lasagna from a box, the kind with pictures of happy American families on the packaging, and Dad pushed it around his plate with a bewildered expression of someone who no longer recognized his own home. The argument started in whispered Mandarin after they thought I was asleep, but our apartment walls were thin and their voices carried more than they realized. I understood enough to know they were talking about me, about my rejection of Popo's cooking lessons, about the recipe book that had mysteriously disappeared from the kitchen counter. "She's ashamed of us," Mom's voice cracked through the wall separating our bedrooms. "We brought her to this country to give her opportunities, and now she's embarrassed by everything we are." Dad's responses were quieter, harder to make out, but I caught fragments about adaptation and sacrifice, and children growing up American whether their parents understood it or not. My younger brother Kevin started following my lead without anyone teaching him to. At 8 years old, he possessed the adaptability that made everything look effortless. But I watched him begin to wrinkle his nose when Mom occasionally tried to prepare traditional meals, pushing away the bok choy and asking for chicken nuggets instead. "Like Maya has," he'd say, pointing at my increasingly American lunch bags with the confidence of someone who'd found a roadmap to acceptance. Mom would look between us with an expression I was only beginning to understand was heartbreak disguised as accommodation. The transformation of our kitchen happened gradually, so slowly I almost didn't notice until it was complete. The rice cooker disappeared first, relegated to a high cabinet where it gathered dust between increasingly rare occasions when Mom felt brave enough to attempt traditional meals. The special cleaver Dad had bought her for Christmas, the one she'd used to prepare vegetables with the precision of an artist, sat unused in the drawer while she struggled with dull American knives that couldn't achieve the paper-thin cuts her recipes required. The bottles of dark soy sauce and rice wine that used to line our counter were moved to the back of the pantry, hidden behind boxes of instant mac and cheese and canned soup. Mom threw herself into learning American cooking with the same intensity she'd once devoted to perfecting her grandmother's recipes, but there was something desperate about her efforts now. Something that felt like erasure rather than expansion. She bought cookbooks with titles like Easy Weeknight Dinners and Kid-Friendly Meals, studying them with the focus of someone preparing for an exam she couldn't afford to fail. When she successfully produced a meatloaf that Kevin and I ate without complaint, her smile was bright but hollow, like she was celebrating a victory that felt more like surrender. The breaking point came during the Spring School Carnival, where families were asked to contribute dishes for the International Food Fair. Mom spent days preparing for what she saw as an opportunity to share our culture, to show my classmates that Chinese food could be beautiful and approachable. She made spring rolls with translucent wrappers that looked like small jewels, dumplings arranged in perfect spirals, and a mild sweet and sour chicken that she'd adapted to appeal to American palates. She dressed carefully that morning, wearing her best blouse and the jade earrings Popo had given her for luck. I watched the disaster unfold from across the gymnasium, seeing my mother's proud smile falter as family after family passed by her table without stopping. The few parents who did approach took polite small portions, nodding appreciatively before moving on to the more familiar territory of Italian pasta salads and Mexican quesadillas. Jessica Chen's mother made a show of trying the spring rolls, commenting loudly about how interesting they were, her tone suggesting that interesting was not necessarily good. By the end of the evening, Mom was packing up containers of barely touched food while other parents scraped empty dishes clean. That night, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with the remaining spring rolls spread in front of her. eating them slowly like she was trying to remember something important. "Maybe next year I'll bring brownies," she said when she noticed me watching, her voice attempting lightness but landing somewhere closer to defeat. "Everyone likes brownies." The resignation in her voice made something twist in my stomach, but I nodded anyway, agreeing that brownies would be better, safer, more normal. I went to bed that night with the taste of guilt sharp in my mouth, but not sharp enough to make me want to change anything. Kevin's transformation accelerated after the school carnival, as if he'd witnessed firsthand the social cost of being different and decided to avoid it entirely. He started refusing to speak Mandarin at home, claiming he was forgetting it anyway, that it was easier to just use English for everything. When Popo called from San Francisco, he'd hand the phone directly to Mom instead of struggling through the conversations that used to delight her. "I can't understand her anymore," he'd shrug, but I caught him practicing American phrases in the mirror, working to eliminate any trace of accent he'd never actually had. The final break came when Popo announced she was returning to China permanently, disappointed by what she saw as her family's wholesale abandonment of their heritage. The conversation happened in rapid Mandarin over the phone, Mom's voice rising and falling with explanations and justifications, while Popo's responses grew shorter and more clipped. When Mom hung up, she sat staring at the phone for a long time before turning to Dad and saying, in English, "She says we've lost ourselves trying to find acceptance. She says the children she knew don't exist anymore." That weekend, Dad packed away the last of our obviously Chinese decorations, rolling up the calligraphy scrolls Popo had given us and storing the ceramic tea set we'd used for special occasions. "It's better this way," he said, but his movements were mechanical, like he was performing surgery on his own memories. "The children need to fit in. We all need to fit in." Mom nodded in agreement, but I saw her run her fingers over each item before it disappeared into storage boxes, like she was saying goodbye to pieces of herself. The house felt different afterward. Lighter in some ways, but hollow in others, like a shell that had been cleaned out and painted over. We looked like any other American family now, eating dinner from matching plates instead of the mismatched bowls that had somehow made every meal feel special, speaking only English even when Mandarin words would have been more precise, more true. When school friends came over, there was nothing for them to comment on, nothing that marked us as different or foreign or other. I'd gotten exactly what I thought I wanted, but sitting at our newly anonymous dinner table, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd traded something irreplaceable for the simple comfort of being invisible. The last time I tried to find Mom's recipe book, the one I'd hidden under my bed, it was gone. When I asked her about it weeks later, she just smiled sadly and said she'd put it somewhere safe, somewhere it wouldn't get lost. I never found it again, and eventually I stopped looking, accepting that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with good intentions and regret alone. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to reinvent myself completely without the weight of family expectations or middle school humiliations. At Northwestern, surrounded by kids from prep schools and suburbs who'd never questioned their place in the world, I felt like I'd finally achieved the invisibility I'd spent years cultivating. My dorm room was aggressively normal, decorated with the same mass-produced posters and string lights as every other freshman girl. My mini fridge stocked with the kind of processed snacks that required no cultural translation. When people asked about my background, I'd mention Chicago in a way that suggested the suburbs, letting them fill in assumptions about soccer practice and shopping malls rather than correcting their mental image with stories about immigrant parents and cultural displacement. The Northwestern dining hall was an endless buffet of American comfort food, pizza stations, and sandwich bars, and soft-serve ice cream machines that ran continuously. I navigated it like someone who'd been eating institutional food her entire life, loading my tray with familiar items while avoiding the international section entirely. There was something deeply satisfying about blending in so completely, about being just another college student complaining about dining hall quality rather than someone who had to explain her food choices or defend her family's traditions. For the first time since middle school, I could eat in public without thinking about it, without calculating whether my choices would mark me as different. That illusion of successful assimilation lasted exactly 4 months. It was a Tuesday in January, gray and bitter cold, when I found myself alone in the dining hall during the dead zone between lunch and dinner. Most students were in class or buried in the library, and the skeleton crew of food service workers was restocking stations for the evening rush. I was picking at a sad salad, killing time before my next class, when I caught the scent of ginger and soy sauce drifting from the Asian food station. The smell hit me like a physical blow, transporting me instantly back to Popo's kitchen, to Sunday mornings when the whole house smelled like star anise and possibility. I found myself walking toward the station without conscious decision, drawn by aromas I'd trained myself to avoid. The food looked institutional, nothing like the carefully prepared dishes of my childhood. but there were dumplings sitting under heat lamps, their pleated edges identical to the ones my mother used to fold with such precision. I took one, then another, loading my plate with fried rice and vegetables that bore only passing resemblance to the dishes Popo had tried to teach me to make. When I bit into the first dumpling, the filling was bland and oversalted, nothing like the complex flavors I remembered, but the texture, the weight of it on my tongue, unlocked something I'd been holding closed for years. I made it exactly 3 bites before I started crying. Right there, in the middle of the dining hall, great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my chest. The taste carried with it every Sunday morning I'd rejected, every cooking lesson I'd avoided, every time I'd chosen the safety of assimilation over the risk of being seen as different. The institutional dumpling became every meal I'd thrown away, every disappointed look on my mother's face when I'd asked for American food instead. Every moment I'd chosen invisibility over identity. A dining hall worker approached cautiously, asking if I was okay, and I couldn't even begin to explain that I was mourning the parts of myself I'd systematically discarded. The breakdown in the dining hall was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, I found myself caught between 2 worlds I no longer knew how to navigate. My attempts to reconnect with Chinese culture felt forced and artificial, like putting on clothes that no longer fit. I'd grown up in an American suburb, gone to American schools, absorbed American values about individualism and self-determination. But the complete rejection of my heritage had left me feeling unmoored, like I was floating without anchor in a cultural space that wasn't quite mine either. When other students talked about their family traditions, their grandmother's recipes, their childhood memories of holiday celebrations, I had nothing to contribute except stories about successful assimilation and cultural abandonment. I started cooking in my dorm room using a contraband hot plate hidden in my closet and ingredients smuggled back from trips to the Asian grocery store in Chicago. My roommate Sarah tolerated the smells at first, even expressing curiosity about what I was making. But my attempts to recreate dishes from memory were disasters. Without recipes, without the muscle memory of watching my mother and grandmother work, I was fumbling in the dark, creating sad approximations that tasted like homesickness and regret. The kitchen skills I should have inherited had been sacrificed on the altar of fitting in, leaving me with nothing but vague recollections and a growing sense of loss. The worst part was calling home and hearing the careful distance in my mother's voice when I mentioned my cooking experiments. "That's nice, Beta," she'd say, her tone pleasant but hollow, like she was talking to a stranger who happened to share some common interests. The easy intimacy we'd once shared over food preparation was gone, replaced by polite conversations about my classes and the weather and whether I was eating enough. When I asked her about specific recipes, about the techniques Popo had tried to teach me, she'd deflect with suggestions that I could find anything I wanted online, that young people didn't need to learn the old ways anymore. The isolation was complete in a way I hadn't anticipated. I didn't fit with the international students who'd maintained strong connections to their home cultures and spoke about their heritage with pride and specificity. Their casual fluency in languages I'd forgotten, their comfort with traditions I'd rejected, only highlighted how thoroughly I'd severed my own roots. But I also didn't belong with the American students who took their cultural inheritance for granted, who complained about family obligations and traditional expectations, while having no idea what it felt like to voluntarily amputate those connections. I existed in a strange liminal space, too American for my heritage and too foreign for my birthplace. The crisis peaked during spring break of sophomore year when I came home to find our family kitchen completely transformed. Mom had embraced American cooking so thoroughly that there wasn't a single recognizable element of our old life remaining. The pantry was stocked with jarred sauces and frozen meals, the refrigerator filled with prepackaged convenience foods that required no skill or cultural knowledge to prepare. When I asked about the wok that used to hang from the wall, Mom shrugged and said she'd donated it to Goodwill along with the other things we didn't use anymore. "It was just taking up space," she explained, but her voice carried the same hollow quality I'd been hearing for years. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom surrounded by the generic decorations I'd chosen to replace anything that might mark me as different, and realized I'd succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. I was perfectly, completely, unremarkably American. I could navigate any social situation without fear of cultural exposure, could eat in any restaurant without worrying about strange looks or comments about farm smells. I'd achieved the invisibility I desperately wanted in 7th grade, but the victory felt like ash in my mouth. I'd traded my heritage for acceptance, and discovered that acceptance without identity was just another form of emptiness. The call to Popo came at 3 in the morning, driven by desperation and insomnia and the growing certainty that I'd made a terrible mistake. She answered on the second ring, despite the time difference. Her voice immediately alert in the way that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation for years. Xiao Bao, she said, using the pet name from my childhood that meant little dumpling. I wondered when you would call. When I tried to explain my crisis in English, she responded in Mandarin, and I realized with horror that I could barely understand her anymore. The language of my childhood had become as foreign as the culture I'd rejected, leaving me stranded between worlds with no way home to either. The conversation with Popo lasted 3 hours and changed everything, even though I understood maybe half of what she said. Her Mandarin came back to me in pieces, fragments of childhood vocabulary mixing with the formal phrases I'd learned in my high school language requirement, creating a broken bridge between who I used to be and who I'd become. She spoke about recipes the way other people talked about family history, each dish carrying stories of survival and adaptation, of women who'd maintained their identity through decades of displacement and hardship. Food is memory, she said in the careful English she reserved for important moments. You throw away food, you throw away yourself. When I hung up, my hands were shaking with something that felt like recognition. I'd been approaching my cultural disconnection like a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be rebuilt, expecting instant fluency in traditions I'd spent years actively forgetting. Popo's words echoed in my head as I walked through campus the next day, seeing the international students with new eyes, noticing how they gathered around food from home like it was a sacred ritual rather than just dinner. The Chinese graduate students who ate together every Friday, speaking rapid Mandarin over steaming bowls of noodles, weren't being exclusionary. They were maintaining something I'd voluntarily severed. The decision to change my major felt inevitable once I'd acknowledged what I'd lost. Pre-med had been my parents' dream. Their vision of American success, translated into a career that would prove their sacrifice, had been worthwhile. But sitting in organic chemistry, memorizing molecular structures while thinking about the molecular gastronomy I'd seen on cooking shows, I realized I was studying to become someone else's version of success rather than pursuing anything that felt authentic to who I was or who I wanted to become. The conversation with my parents about switching to culinary arts was the first real fight we'd had in years, maybe because it was the first time I'd expressed a preference that couldn't be easily accommodated. Cooking is not a career, Dad said, his voice tight with the disappointment he'd been holding back for months. Cooking is what people do when they can't do anything else. Mom sat silent during most of the argument, but her occasional nod suggested agreement with his position. They'd worked too hard to establish themselves in America for their daughter to choose a profession they saw as taking steps backward, returning to the service industry roles they'd fought to escape. You want to work in restaurants your whole life? Dad continued. You want to spend your time making food for other people instead of using your brain? The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents, who'd once filled our kitchen with the aromas of complex traditional cooking, now saw professional food preparation as beneath their American-born daughter. Their own relationship with food had become so tangled up in questions of status and assimilation that they couldn't see cooking as anything other than manual labor, couldn't imagine it as a form of artistic expression or cultural preservation. When I tried to explain my interest in fusion cuisine, in combining traditional techniques with modern presentation, Mom's expression suggested I was describing an elaborate way to waste my education. The financial aspect of my decision hit immediately. My parents had been covering tuition and living expenses with the understanding that I was preparing for a lucrative medical career that would eventually justify their investment. Culinary school meant lower earning potential, longer hours, a path they couldn't respect or support. If you want to cook, Mom said during our final conversation about money, you can do it on your own. The words felt familiar, like an echo of every time I'd chosen independence over family expectation. But this time the stakes were higher and the safety net was disappearing. I took out student loans for culinary school with the grim determination of someone who'd finally found direction, but couldn't afford to pursue it. The Culinary Institute of Chicago was a different world from Northwestern, filled with students who'd grown up in restaurant families or discovered their passion through years of kitchen work rather than cultural awakening. My classmates had knife skills and professional experience, stories about working prep shifts since high school and learning technique from chef relatives. I arrived with enthusiasm and a profound ignorance of even basic cooking fundamentals, the practical knowledge I should have absorbed through childhood observation completely absent. The learning curve was brutal. While other students instinctively knew how to hold a knife, how to organize their stations, how to taste and adjust to seasoning, I struggled with tasks that should have been automatic. My hands had no memory of the precise cutting techniques I'd watched my mother and grandmother perform effortlessly. My palate had no reference point for the complex flavor profiles that defined authentic Chinese cuisine. The Western techniques came easier, but even there I was starting from zero. lacking the foundation that most of my classmates took for granted. My first job was at a downtown restaurant called Golden Phoenix, one of those generic Chinese-American places that served sweet and sour pork to office workers and weekend families looking for affordable ethnic food. The kitchen was run by an older man named Chen who'd immigrated 20 years earlier and built his business around dishes that bore little resemblance to anything from his homeland. He hired me for prep work, cutting vegetables and assembling spring rolls, tasks that required speed and consistency rather than creativity or cultural knowledge. Working at Golden Phoenix was like getting a crash course in the compromises that defined Chinese-American cuisine. Every dish was adapted for American palates, sweetened and simplified until it became a cartoon version of traditional flavors. The orange chicken bore no relationship to any chicken dish from China. The fried rice was a stir-fry of leftover ingredients held together by soy sauce and cornstarch. But watching Chen navigate between authenticity and commercial viability taught me something important about survival, about the ways immigrants adapted their skills to find success in a market that didn't understand or appreciate their traditions. The breakthrough came 6 months into my time at Golden Phoenix, when Chen discovered I spoke some Mandarin and had family recipes I'd never learned to make. "You want to learn real cooking?" he asked one slow Tuesday afternoon, gesturing toward the empty dining room. "Not this American Chinese food, but real techniques?" He spent the next 2 hours teaching me to make proper mapo tofu, guiding my hands as I learned to control heat and timing, explaining the theory behind flavor combinations I'd tasted in childhood but never understood. For the first time since starting culinary school, I felt like I was learning something that connected to who I actually was, rather than who I thought I should become. Chen became an unexpected mentor, teaching me traditional techniques during slow periods and connecting me with other Chinese cooks who worked in the city's restaurant scene. Through him, I met elderly women who'd maintained authentic cooking knowledge through decades in America, chefs who'd found ways to honor their heritage while building successful businesses. They shared stories about the constant balance between tradition and adaptation, about maintaining cultural integrity while serving customers who expected familiar flavors and recognizable presentations. The real education happened after hours, when Chen and the other cooks would prepare meals for themselves using ingredients and techniques they never brought to the dining room. These were the dishes they'd grown up eating, complex and subtle and completely different from anything on our menu. Watching them cook with the confidence and intuition I'd lost, I began to understand what Po Po had meant about food being memory. Every movement they made carried generations of knowledge, techniques passed down through families and refined through years of practice. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild the connections I'd severed. Chen taught me to fold dumplings the way my mother had tried to show me years earlier, his patient corrections helping my hands remember movements they'd once rejected. I learned to taste with intention, to identify the layers of flavor that made traditional dishes complex rather than simply exotic. The process was humbling and frustrating and occasionally heartbreaking, like learning a language I should have spoken fluently but had chosen to forget. The real test came when Chen suggested I call my mother and ask for Popo's recipes, the ones I'd lost when I'd hidden away our family cookbook. "She still has them," he said with the certainty of someone who understood how Chinese families preserved their culinary heritage. "Mothers always keep the recipes, even when children don't want to learn." The conversation with Mom was awkward and tentative, both of us dancing around the years of distance we'd created. But when I explained what I was trying to accomplish, her voice softened with something that might have been hope. "I'll call Po," she said. "Maybe it's not too late to remember." The package from Po arrived 3 weeks later, a carefully wrapped box that felt heavier than its size suggested. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that still carried the faint scent of her apartment, I found photocopies of handwritten recipes in her precise Chinese characters, each one annotated with notes in the margins that I struggled to decipher. There were also photographs I'd never seen before, images of my grandmother as a young woman working in commercial kitchens, of my mother learning to cook as a teenager, a family gathering centered around elaborate meals that represented everything I'd been too ashamed to claim. At the bottom of the box was a brief note in Popo's careful English. "These are yours now, don't let them disappear again." Working from Popo's recipes was like trying to reconstruct a conversation from fragments of overheard words. Her measurements were written in traditional Chinese units I had to convert. Her techniques described in shorthand that assumed knowledge I didn't possess. "Add ginger until it smells like home," one recipe instructed, leaving me to guess what home had smelled like to a woman who'd lived through war and immigration, and decades of adaptation. I called Chen constantly during those first weeks, reading him ingredient lists and technique descriptions, asking him to translate not just the language but the cultural context that gave each dish meaning. The food truck idea came from desperation as much as inspiration. My student loans were mounting, my part-time work at Golden Phoenix wasn't covering basic expenses, and the traditional restaurant industry seemed closed to someone with my limited experience and ambiguous cultural positioning. Food trucks required less startup capital than brick-and-mortar restaurants, offered more creative freedom than working in someone else's kitchen, and gave me a chance to experiment with the fusion concept that had been developing in my mind since I'd started learning traditional techniques. I spent months developing recipes that honored Popo's traditional foundations while acknowledging my American upbringing and education. The dan dan noodles I created used traditional Sichuan peppercorns and fermented bean paste, but I served them in portions and presentations that would appeal to lunch crowds unfamiliar with authentic Chinese cuisine. My xiaolongbao were filled with traditional pork and ginger, but I also offered versions with short rib and kimchi, with duck confit and hoisin, combinations that would have horrified purists but reflected the multicultural reality of American dining. Finding the initial funding required swallowing pride I'd been carefully rebuilding. I approached my parents with a business plan and financial projections, asking them to see past their disappointment about my career change and recognize the practical potential of what I was proposing. The conversation happened in our kitchen, surrounded by the generic appliances and processed foods that had replaced everything distinctive about our family's relationship with cooking. Mom read through my proposals, with the same careful attention she'd once given to recipe instructions, while Dad examined my financial calculations with the skeptical eye of someone who'd built his own business from nothing. "This is not stable work," Dad said finally, his voice carrying the weight of every immigrant parent's fear about their children choosing uncertain paths. "Food trucks fail all the time. Restaurants fail. You have education. You could still change your mind about medical school." But Mom surprised me by speaking up, her voice quiet but firm. "She's trying to save something we lost," she said, looking directly at Dad rather than me. "Maybe we should help her try." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd had in years, all of us acknowledging the cultural disconnection that had defined our family dynamics, the ways we'd sacrificed identity for the illusion of belonging. The loan they offered came with conditions that felt like a test of my commitment. I had to prove market viability within 6 months, maintain detailed financial records, and develop a sustainable business model that could eventually repay their investment. More importantly, I had to promise that this wasn't just a phase, that I wasn't using their money to fund an expensive exploration of cultural identity that would end when I got bored or discouraged. "If you fail," Dad said, his tone gentle but serious, "you don't get to blame anyone else. And you don't get to quit and expect us to support another career change." Finding the truck was an adventure in itself, a search through used vehicle lots and classified ads for something that could be converted into a mobile kitchen without bankrupting me before I'd served a single customer. I eventually found a former ice cream truck with good bones and a functional electrical system, spending weeks learning to install commercial equipment and navigate health department regulations. The renovation process was a crash course in small business ownership, from understanding food safety protocols to designing workflow patterns that would allow me to cook efficiently in a space barely larger than my childhood bedroom. The first day of service was a disaster disguised as a learning experience. I'd positioned the truck near the financial district, hoping to catch lunch crowds looking for quick, interesting meals. But my timing was off, my portions were inconsistent, and my service was painfully slow. The dan dan noodles that had tasted perfect during test runs became gluey and oversalted under the pressure of real customers, and I ran out of xiaolongbao filling halfway through the lunch rush. By closing time, I'd served maybe 30 customers and felt like I'd failed at every aspect of food service simultaneously. But something kept me coming back the next day, and the day after that, driven by a stubbornness that felt inherited from generations of women who'd made things work through sheer persistence. I started waking up at 4 a.m. to prep ingredients, refining my recipes based on customer feedback, learning to read lunch crowds, and adjust my preparation accordingly. The Sichuan chicken sandwich that had seemed too ambitious during planning became my most popular item, the combination of numbing spice and familiar format appealing to adventurous eaters who wanted authenticity with accessibility. The breakthrough came 3 months in, when a food blogger from the Chicago Tribune tried my truck and wrote a review that changed everything overnight. She understood what I was trying to accomplish, describing my food as a thoughtful bridge between tradition and innovation, created by someone who clearly understands both the cultural significance and commercial potential of authentic fusion cuisine. The review mentioned specific dishes by name, praised the quality of my ingredients, and positioned my truck as part of a new generation of ethnic food entrepreneurs who weren't willing to sacrifice authenticity for mass appeal. The lines started forming the next day and never stopped. Customers who'd never heard of Dan Dan noodles became regulars. Office workers began planning their lunch schedules around my location. And food enthusiasts started posting photos of my xiaolongbao on social media with hashtags that boosted my visibility exponentially. I had to hire help for the first time, training college students to handle cash and simple prep work while I focused on cooking and managing the increasingly complex logistics of running a successful food truck. The success brought unexpected challenges alongside the obvious rewards. My ingredient costs increased as I refused to compromise on quality. My equipment broke down under the stress of constant use, and I struggled to maintain consistency while scaling up production. But perhaps most difficult was navigating the expectations that came with being recognized as a representative of Chinese American cuisine, feeling the weight of cultural authenticity while serving customers who sometimes had very specific ideas about what ethnic food should taste like or cost. The phone call from Jessica Chen came on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after the Tribune review had transformed my business from struggling startup to local phenomenon. I didn't recognize her voice immediately, but when she identified herself and mentioned she'd seen my truck featured in a local magazine, the old familiar panic rose in my throat. "I'd love to try your food," she said, her tone casual and friendly, as if we'd been acquaintances rather than tormentor and victim. "My friends and I have been meaning to check out your truck. We heard the wait can be pretty long now." I managed to give her my schedule and location information, my voice steady despite the 20-year-old shame that had suddenly resurfaced, wondering if she remembered what she'd said about farm smells, or if cruelty from middle school had faded into forgettable background noise for her, the way it had shaped my entire relationship with food for me. The decision to open a brick-and-mortar restaurant felt inevitable once the food truck had proven the concept, but it also felt like jumping off a cliff while hoping I'd learn to fly during the fall. The success of my mobile operation had given me credibility with investors and landlords, but it had also raised the stakes in ways that kept me awake at night, calculating costs and worrying about the dozens of ways a restaurant could fail even when the food was good. The space I found was in a gentrifying neighborhood on the edge of downtown, a former antique shop with good bones but decades of deferred maintenance that would require months of renovation, and most of my savings to make functional. The name came to me during one of my late-night conversations with Popo, who'd started calling regularly to check on my progress and offer unsolicited advice about everything from menu pricing to staff management. "You need name that tells story," she said in her practical way. "Not just Chinese name, not just American name. Name that says who you are now." Golden Roots felt right immediately, honoring the traditional foundations while acknowledging the growth that had happened through adaptation and struggle. When I told her my choice, Popo was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Good. Roots grow deeper when they have good soil." The restaurant design process became an exercise in translating the cultural fusion I'd achieved with food into a physical space that would feel authentic without being a cliché. I worked with a designer who understood my vision of combining traditional Chinese elements with modern American aesthetics, creating a dining room that felt elevated but not intimidating, familiar but not generic. The open kitchen concept let customers watch the cooking process, seeing the technique and care that went into each dish rather than receiving food from an invisible source. Every design choice was deliberate, from the lighting that made the food photography ready to the acoustics that allowed conversation without requiring shouting. The permit process was a masterclass in bureaucratic patience, months of health department inspections and fire safety reviews and zoning compliance checks that tested every aspect of my business plan. I learned to navigate city government with the same persistence I'd applied to mastering dumpling folding, showing up to appointments with color-coded documentation and backup plans for every potential objection. The delays ate into my opening timeline and budget, forcing me to take on additional investors and extending my period of financial vulnerability. But they also gave me time to refine every aspect of the operation, from menu design to staff training protocols. Hiring staff for Golden Roots required finding people who could execute my vision while understanding the cultural significance behind what we were serving. I needed cooks who could handle traditional Chinese techniques alongside modern plating aesthetics, servers who could explain the stories behind unfamiliar dishes without sounding condescending, managers who could maintain quality standards during busy service periods while keeping costs under control. The interviews felt like casting calls for a very specific type of performance, finding people who could represent my restaurant's identity authentically while serving customers who came with varying levels of cultural knowledge and culinary adventurousness. Training my kitchen staff became an intensive course in the fusion philosophy I developed over years of experimentation. Each dish on our menu had traditional roots that needed to be respected, alongside modern adaptations that made them accessible to broader audiences. Teaching my cooks to make proper xiaolongbao required explaining not just the technique, But the cultural importance of the soup-filled dumplings, why the pleating pattern mattered, why we couldn't rush the steaming process even during busy service periods. The mapo tofu had to balance authentic Sichuan flavors with heat levels that wouldn't overwhelm diners unfamiliar with numbing spice, requiring constant tasting and adjustment to maintain the dish's integrity while ensuring broad appeal. The soft opening was limited to friends, family, and industry professionals who could provide honest feedback without the pressure of public reviews or social media scrutiny. Mom and Dad attended together, their first visit to any restaurant I'd worked in, sitting awkwardly at a corner table while I watched from the kitchen window. Seeing them taste the dan-dan noodles I'd perfected, watching Mom's expression change as she recognized flavors from her own childhood transformed through my training and vision, felt like a vindication of every difficult choice I'd made since switching majors. Dad asked careful questions about portion costs and profit margins, his businessman's mind engaged despite his ongoing skepticism about the restaurant industry's stability. The opening reviews exceeded my most optimistic expectations, with food critics recognizing both the technical skill and cultural authenticity that I'd worked years to develop. The Chicago Tribune's restaurant critic wrote about Golden Roots as a sophisticated exploration of Chinese-American identity through food, where traditional techniques meet contemporary presentation without sacrificing the soul of either tradition. Food and Wine included us in their monthly roundup of notable new openings, praising our thoughtful approach to fusion cuisine that respects its cultural foundations while embracing creative innovation. Each positive review brought new customers and raised expectations, creating pressure to maintain consistency while continuing to evolve and improve. The Michelin recognition came 8 months after opening, when the annual guide included Golden Roots among Chicago's recommended restaurants with a notation for exceptional cuisine that reflects the chef's personal journey and cultural heritage. The day the guide was published, our reservation system crashed from the sudden influx of booking attempts, and we had to implement a waitlist that stretched weeks into the future. The recognition validated everything I'd sacrificed to reach this point, but it also transformed the restaurant from neighborhood gem to destination dining, changing the expectations and demographics of our customer base in ways that required constant adaptation. Managing success proved more challenging than surviving struggle had been. The increased visibility brought opportunities for expansion, cookbook deals, television appearances, and consulting work that could have provided financial security, but threatened to dilute my focus on the restaurant that had made everything else possible. I turned down most offers, choosing to concentrate on perfecting Golden Roots rather than building a culinary empire. But the constant decisions about growth versus sustainability exhausted me in ways that physical labor never had. Every success brought new pressures and responsibilities that required skills I'd never been taught in culinary school or developed during my food truck apprenticeship. The staff expansion necessary to handle our increased volume meant training new cooks in techniques and philosophy that had taken me years to develop, trusting them to maintain standards while I couldn't personally oversee every dish leaving the kitchen. I promoted Chen from the food truck operation to head chef, his experience with both traditional and commercial cooking making him the perfect bridge between my vision and practical execution. Together, we developed systems for maintaining quality during high-volume service, creating detailed recipes that preserve the nuanced flavors while allowing for consistent reproduction by multiple cooks. The reservation that changed everything came through our online system on a Wednesday afternoon in late spring, 14 months after opening. The name Jessica Chen didn't immediately register in our booking software, filed alphabetically among hundreds of other reservations for the following week. It wasn't until I was reviewing the upcoming schedule that I saw it, a party of 4 for Friday night at 8 p.m., and felt the familiar twist of anxiety that her name still triggered after all these years. The reservation included a note requesting the chef's tasting menu, suggesting she'd done research about our offerings rather than choosing Golden Roots randomly from a list of trendy restaurants. I stared at the computer screen for a long time, memories of middle school cafeterias and farm smell comments flooding back with surprising intensity. Part of me wanted to cancel her reservation, to claim we were fully booked and spare myself the confrontation with someone who'd shaped my relationship with cultural identity through casual cruelty. But another part, the part that had built this restaurant through years of determination and cultural reclamation, felt ready for the conversation that had been postponed for over 15 years. Golden Roots represented everything I'd achieved by refusing to let shame define my relationship with food and heritage. If Jessica Chen wanted to eat my cooking, I was going to let her experience exactly what she'd tried to make me ashamed of, elevated through skill and presentation into something undeniably beautiful. Friday evening arrived with the particular tension that precedes moments you've been unconsciously preparing for your entire adult life. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen with unusual focus, tasting each component of the chef's tasting menu multiple times, adjusting seasoning and plating with the precision of someone who understood that this meal carried weight beyond normal service. The xiaolongbao were perfect, their pleated tops twisted with the mathematical precision Po Po had insisted upon, the broth inside each dumpling clear and intensely flavored. The dan dan noodles had exactly the right balance of numbing Sichuan peppercorns and rich sesame paste, the sauce coating each strand without becoming heavy or overwhelming. Every dish represented years of learning, of rebuilding connections I'd severed, of transforming shame into something approaching pride. Jessica arrived exactly on time with 3 companions, all of them dressed in the carefully casual style that suggested successful careers and disposable income. From the kitchen window, I watched her survey the dining room with the appraising eye of someone accustomed to evaluating restaurants for social media posts and friend group recommendations. She looked older, obviously, but carried herself with the same confident ease that had made her middle school pronouncements feel like absolute judgments. Her companions seemed pleasant enough, chatting easily while reviewing menus, unaware that their dinner companion had unknowingly shaped the trajectory of the chef's entire career through a moment of casual cruelty 15 years earlier. I let them settle in, order drinks, and begin working through the appetizer course before I made my appearance. The timing felt important somehow, allowing Jessica to experience the food without the complication of recognizing me, letting her form opinions based purely on taste and presentation, rather than the awkwardness of unexpected reunion. I watched through the kitchen window as she tried the cold sesame noodles, saw her expression change from polite interest to genuine surprise, noticed the way she slowed down to savor flavors rather than eating with the distracted efficiency of someone going through social motions. When I finally approached their table, wearing chef's whites that announced my role before I said anything, Jessica looked up with the pleased expression of someone about to compliment a meal. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "I'm Maya, the chef and owner. I wanted to thank you for choosing Golden Roots tonight." The recognition dawned slowly, her smile faltering as she processed my face against memories from another lifetime. "Maya," she repeated, her voice uncertain. "Maya Chen, from Lincoln Middle School?" The name confirmation felt like stepping off a cliff, but I'd built enough strength over the intervening years to handle the fall. "That's right," I replied, maintaining eye contact despite the familiar urge to look away, to retreat, to minimize myself in the face of her attention. "I noticed your reservation and wanted to personally ensure you had a good experience." Her companions glanced between us, sensing undercurrents they couldn't interpret, while Jessica processed the reality of being served by someone she'd once mocked for bringing exactly the type of food that now filled her plate. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before she spoke again, her voice softer than I remembered. "This is incredible," she said, gesturing toward the half-finished appetizers. "I had no idea you were a chef. This food is amazing." The conversation that followed was surreal in its normalcy, Jessica asking the polite questions diners ask about ingredient sourcing and cooking techniques, while I provided answers that felt like small acts of cultural education. I explained the provenance of our Sichuan peppercorns, the traditional methods behind our dumpling making, the cultural significance of the dishes that had once made her wrinkle her nose in disgust. Her genuine interest seemed authentic rather than performative, her questions thoughtful rather than dismissive, suggesting that 15 years had perhaps provided her with perspective on cultural diversity that had been absent during our shared adolescence. When I brought out the xiaolongbao course personally, placing the steamer basket in front of her with the same care I'd use for any guest, Jessica paused before taking her first bite. "These look exactly like something you used to bring for lunch," she said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that might have been apology or recognition or simply observation. I remember thinking they looked so complicated, so foreign. The word hung in the air between us, laden with implications neither of us was quite ready to address directly. "They are complicated," I replied, watching her bite carefully into the dumpling, feeling satisfaction as the clear broth ran down her chin, despite her attempt at delicate eating. The rest of the meal proceeded with careful politeness, Jessica's companions filling conversational gaps, while she and I navigated the strange territory of present tense interaction layered over past tense trauma. I checked on their table more frequently than necessary, driven by curiosity about her reactions to dishes that represented my cultural reclamation project. Each positive comment she made felt like a small vindication, not because I needed her approval, but because her enjoyment demonstrated the distance I'd traveled from the scared middle schooler who'd thrown away her mother's cooking rather than endure more mockery. The most significant moment came when Jessica asked to speak privately as her group was finishing dessert. We stepped into the quieter alcove near the host station, away from other diners and her companion's curious attention. "I need to apologize," she said without preamble, her directness surprising me. "What I said about your lunch back in 7th grade was cruel and ignorant. I was a kid trying to fit in by making someone else feel like they didn't belong, and I've thought about it more often than you probably imagine. Seeing what you've built here, tasting this incredible food that honors your heritage while being absolutely delicious, it makes me realize what an idiot I was." The apology felt both inadequate and unnecessary, coming 15 years too late to change anything, but somehow still meaningful in its acknowledgement of harm caused. "You were 13, I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "We were all trying to figure out how to belong somewhere." But even as I offered the gracious response, I couldn't forget the years of shame that had followed her casual comment, the cultural disconnection I'd chosen rather than risk further humiliation, the family relationships damaged by my desperate attempts to assimilate. Her childhood cruelty had been a catalyst rather than a root cause, but it had shaped my relationship with identity in ways that took years to repair. "Still," Jessica continued, "I want you to know that this meal has been one of the best dining experiences I've had in Chicago. The food is sophisticated and delicious, and it's clear that every dish comes from someone who really understands both the traditional techniques and how to present them for contemporary diners. You should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." Her words felt genuine rather than obligatory, informed by the actual experience of eating my food rather than abstract politeness, and I found myself accepting the compliment without the reflexive self-deprecation that had characterized my younger responses to praise. As her group prepared to leave, Jessica handed me her business card, explaining that she worked in marketing for a food and beverage company that specialized in representing innovative restaurants. "If you're ever interested in expanding or need help with publicity, I'd love to work with you," she said. "What you're doing here deserves a much wider audience." The offer felt like the universe's idea of poetic justice, the girl who'd once mocked my cultural heritage now wanting to help promote it commercially. But I accepted the card graciously, while internally noting the irony of the full circle moment. After they left, I stood in the dining room surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd built, watching my staff clean tables and reset for the next day's service. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a successful evening, servers counting tips and cooks breaking down stations, the ordinary rhythm of hospitality work that had become my chosen life. Mom appeared from the kitchen, where she'd been helping with prep work, her presence at Golden Roots a weekly tradition that had developed organically as she'd reclaimed her own relationship with traditional cooking through supporting mine. "How did it go with your old classmate?" she asked, having noticed my extended conversation with Jessica's table. I considered how to explain the complexity of serving someone who'd shaped my cultural shame, the strange satisfaction of receiving genuine appreciation for food that had once brought me humiliation, the way the evening had felt like closing a chapter I'd been writing unconsciously for 15 years. "It went well," I said finally. She apologized for being cruel when we were kids, and she genuinely appreciated the food. It felt like resolution, I guess. Mom nodded with the understanding of someone who'd watched me navigate the journey from cultural rejection back toward cultural celebration, who'd supported my restaurant even when she couldn't fully comprehend why I'd chosen such a difficult path. "Sometimes the people who hurt us become the ones who help us understand our own strength," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd made her own complicated peace with questions of belonging and identity. "Popo called earlier to ask how service went tonight. She wants to know if you're ready for her to visit and see what you've built." The invitation to Popo felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling for years, the prospect of sharing Golden Roots with the woman whose recipes had provided the foundation for everything I'd accomplished. As I locked up the restaurant that night, checking the dining room one final time before heading home, I realized that Jessica Chen's visit had provided something I hadn't expected. Confirmation that I'd successfully transformed shame into strength, that the food I'd once hidden had become something worth celebrating and sharing. The scared 7th grader who'd thrown away her mother's dumplings had grown into someone who could serve them with pride to anyone, including the person who'd made her ashamed of them in the first place. Walking home through the quiet streets, I thought about the strange trajectory that had brought me from that moment of middle school humiliation to this evening of professional triumph. The girl who'd once begged for peanut butter sandwiches had built a career celebrating the very cultural heritage she'd tried to reject, finding success by refusing to let other people's limitations define her relationship with her own identity. Golden Roots represented more than a restaurant. It was proof that the things we're taught to be ashamed of often contain the seeds of our greatest strengths, that the journey home to ourselves sometimes requires traveling much further away than we ever intended to go.